All right, good afternoon, everyone. I've started the recording for this session. Um, so thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Food Studies seminar hosted by Nanyang Technological University School of Humanities. We're delighted today to have Associate Professor Nicole Tarulevicz from University of Tasmania. A leading food historian, Professor Tarulevicz researches how Singapore's role as a colonial port influences food safety practices and perceptions. Her latest work examines how globalized fears, sparked by issues like Upton Sinclair's, the jungle shaped colonial Singapore's food regulations and public anxieties. Her scholarship is currently supported by the Australian Research Council, and Nicole has written many influential articles and works on Singapore food culture, such as my favorite, her book, Eating Her Curries and Kway. Thank you for joining us, and please welcome Professor Tarulevicz.
Thank you, Kerry. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I was just saying before we got started that Kerry always compliments me on my titles, and today's title has come from a newspaper article, More Revolting Details, and there are lots of revolting details about meat in the 19th century, but I am hoping that I won't turn too many stomachs today. So eating the right foods in the British Empire was gustatory and ideological. So before fish and chips became the kind of canonical British dish, the right foods meant lots of meat, and the most desirable meat was beef. Beef is an icon of Britishness. The yeoman wardens who guard the Tower of London are, of course, called beef eaters, as is the popular gin. The symbolism is fittingly simultaneously imperial and commercial. The British love of roast beef led to the French insult roast buffs. The imaginary store of the Empire Marketing Board was none other than the beefy London grocer, John Bull and Sons. And you can probably just see the name at the very top of the slide there. Beef tea, bouillon cubes, and other beef extracts, and fluid meat being a brand name that a kind of framing that didn't take off, circulated the empire as invalid foods. Actual animals and their flesh circulated in complicated ways too. Mexican stockmen raised calves that were shipped by railroad to be fattened in the US and then exported to be slaughtered in Britain, where they competed with meat raised and butchered locally, with meat raised and butchered in the US, as well as meat prepared and frozen in Argentina, Australia, or New Zealand. Some of this meat was fated to be preserved by canning for transportation and outposts throughout the British Empire. Alongside the trade and circulation of actual meat, ideas about meat circulated too. Meat was desirable, but also risky. It could make you strong, but if improperly stored or cooked, it could make you sick. It was profitable and therefore subject to fraud and adulteration. Readers of English language newspapers in Singapore were well aware of these complicated risks and rewards and anxieties about the safety of food, and responses to it were discursively globalized. Both print culture and publications from overseas that circulated in Singapore worked to create knowledge about and fear of food safety. Because meat mattered in the British Empire, it was a site of multiple interconnected anxieties about availability and quality, and therefore was also a site of status. Meat, as Chris Otter puts it, did not simply symbolize power, it was its physiological source. Meat did not just fuel people, it made them, and it could also unmake them. The prohibit sorry, this is this slide just gives you a sense of some of the multitude of headlines in newspapers, giving you a sense of what people were reading about food safety. So, meat could also unmake people. And I think my favourite example of this is the prohibition on serving roast beef in workhouses in mid century Britain, which highlights how that consumption was constitutive. That is, eating beef made one a member of British society, and those who transgressed through the crime of poverty were forbidden to partake. The centrality of meat to British imperialism was grounded in the view that eating meat made men more vigorous and gave moral authority. Meat, especially beef, was consequently important to the British military as well, and access to it reflected masculinity, class, and social status. And it was absolutely a weapon of war and a tool of conquest, a vital source of stamina, and a right of those in active military service. But not all meat was created equal. Just as the British failed to recognise horse meat as appropriate for human consumption, they viewed Australian kangaroo as bush tucker and not real meat. As Timothy Barnard observes, fish and chicken, whilst edible and understood as food, did not satisfy British stomachs in Singapore. It wasn't real meat. In most British settler societies, the desire for the right kind of meat was met through the importation and breeding of sheep and cattle, what Rebecca Woods describes as enlisting hoof soldiers, which I think is a great phrase, in the expansion of the British Empire. In Singapore, the British were more interested in profits that could be generated through possession of an Asian trading hub and a strategic port than they were in establishing a home for British migrants. Even so, there were attempts to introduce cattle, including for dairy. Such attempts proved fraught and continued to fail into the 20th century. Cattle arrived by boat relatively early in Singapore's colonial history and were sold by auction. In June 1825, for example, 10 calves and one very fine English bull calf of the Devonshire breed, and here is an example of a calf of the Devonshire breed, were to be sold alongside 12 other beasts. But these were not animals for breeding or dairying, but for meat. With limited local pasture, they were penned to recover from travel before slaughter and consumption. In the absence of cold storage, natural or artificial, meat was slaughtered close to the time it was consumed. The Singapore Free Press and Mercantile Advertiser, alongside others, bemoaned the incapacity to hang, dry, and age meat, particularly beef, due to the heat and humidity of tropical conditions. The idea of what constituted fresh operated differently in tropical Singapore, where what we would call controlled rot or aging was not yet subject to imperial controls of temperature and environment. Live trade in animals was difficult, expensive, with high mortality rates, and, as now, subject to scandals about the treatment of animals. Most cattle in 19th century Singapore came from Siam, although some were also from other parts of the Strait settlements, as well as from Australia and British India. Imports varied from year to year, and demand routinely outstripped supply. In 1876, the importation of cattle with foot and mouth disease caused concern, and consumers, especially British residents, wanted reassurance that the meat being slaughtered was sound and fit for food. To concerned writers, this meant it needed to be inspected locally. But not all cattle, diseased or not, even survived the journey. In the 1880s, 1890s, and again in 1901, there was popular discontent about the live animal trade from Bangkok. And just as we saw with the earlier slide of newspaper headlines, the newspapers were filled with this kind of coverage. In 1901, the death of nearly all cattle, that is 100 cows, en route from Bangkok, was a particular scandal. Letters poured into the Singapore Free Press and Mercantile Advertiser from former passengers on boats that had also transported animals and from those in the trade, lamenting the conditions of trade and the cost cutting which imperiled cattle and calling for legislative change and stringent regulations. Even when the cattle arrived in good condition, its identity was suspect. It was asserted by the Straits Times that much of the beef supplied to householders in Singapore, that is, to those elites who could afford fresh meat, was, quote, almost without exception buffalo, and, given its toughness, not only buffalo, but superannuated drought buffalo, that is, old and chewy. For almost 6 years, between 1892 and 1898, the North Australian Butchery Company imported live cattle. When the company decided to suspend trade and sell the vessel that they had used for live animal transportation, consumers lamented the loss of quality beef, complaining, quote, there will be no roast beef worthy of the name, as the suspension in the trade in Australian beef heralded the return of the tough and stringy stuff that passes for meat in the local market. Whether it was beef or buffalo, fresh meat had to be processed somewhere. Clean, ordered, centralised slaughterhouses were a trope of imperial modernity, residing at the intersection of control of public spaces, public health, and bodies, human and animal. A public abattoir was established in Singapore in 1894. By definition, of the Better Management of Municipal Slaughterhouses Bill, the abattoir was for all ruminating animals and swine, that is, not for poultry. The bill also stipulated that the abattoir could be used for the processing of flesh of animals slaughtered outside of the colony, or for wild animals, could not be used for processing that. This facility was of and for Singapore, with the expectation that all fresh meat be slaughtered in a municipal site, regardless of who consumed it. The multiracial and multicultural composition of Singapore complicated social meanings of meat. Indian migrants to Singapore from various castes and religious traditions produced complex relationships to meat, including deep rooted aversion to the production and consumption of meat. As John Solomon notes, untouchability and prejudice against untouchables, associated amongst other things with occupations that involved animal products, was widespread amongst Tamils in the colony well into the 20th century. For Muslims, both Indian and Malay, religious rules around the method of slaughter determined if meat was halal. The legislation which established the abattoir did not directly regulate methods of halal slaughter. Rather, they addressed the issue obliquely. In the second reading of the bill, there was a clause added that compelled the municipal commissioners to, quote, at all times allow any person to slaughter any animal or to dress for sale any carcass at a municipal slaughterhouse on payment of the same fee as if the animal had been killed by an employee. In Legislative Council discussions, Attorney General Collier noted that the clause had been introduced in deference to the religious and social feelings of some classes of people, and explicitly slaughter of animals for sacrificial purposes. The next month, he clarified that the clause had been introduced, quote, to make it clear that the commissioners must allow persons, if they wish, to kill their own animals. And this is a point worth noting. The abattoir was a facility for killing rather than butchering. The dressing, that is, removal of hide and organs, cutting and proportioning of meat, were tasked to be performed by local butchers after the animal had been killed at the abattoir. Despite preservation of trade for local butchers, establishment of the abattoir was a bumpy journey, including a strike by butchers unhappy with a centralised system and with the running of the abattoir. Chinese butchers, who mostly prepared pork, were especially unhappy and boycotted the facility at one point. This situation led to price increases and eventually to the Legislative Council passing an ordinance which outlawed private slaughter and compelled butchers to use the facility. A handful of court cases in the following years highlight a lack of total compliance with the new ordinance, especially amongst the Chinese community, who were most frequently prosecuted. In July 1894, for example, a Chinese man on a rickshaw was caught with a dead pig in a sack, which was confiscated by the police. In 1897, a Chinese butcher was fined $50 for slaughtering a pig within municipal limits, but not at the abattoir. The following year, another pig related case. Two Chinese men were sent to prison for dishonestly disposing of a pig. Issues continued for years, even when meat supply had been brought under municipal control. The discovery in 1895 of pigs which had been slaughtered in the abattoir, which was proved by the presence of the correct markings, what's called a chop mark, applied by inspectors at the abattoir, but which had tapeworm, caused a lot of anxiety. The butcher in question had prior convictions relating to tapeworm infected pigs and was fined $125 for exposing for sale to infected pigs, which at the time was a huge amount of money. The case led the Midday Herald to question if it was safe to eat pork at all. In an editorial, they reminded readers that while the municipal abattoir stamp carried some weight, it did not guarantee the quality of the meat. Consumers still had to beware. Later, a pork butcher was fined $3 for trying to introduce a diseased pig into the abattoir when he passed off one that was already dead as one that had been stunned. He was fined a further $3 for trying to bribe the clerk for arranging butchering, even though the entrails of the pig showed that it had died of disease. In 1896, the Midday Herald had moved from wondering if pork was safe to moaning that the establishment of the abattoir had inflated the price of meat, owing to the great trouble and expense the purveyors are put to sending their cattle there. And while the abattoir assured the public it would put a stop to increasing the weight of pork by soaking or injecting it with water, the Straits budget still found examples of pumped up pork in 1897. Fraud and food safety issues are frequent companions. If water injected into the pork was contaminated, for example, the fraud of a higher price per pound of meat could quickly become a vector of illness. If abattoirs were symbols of colonial order, then cold storage, which allowed frozen shipments of meat to remain frozen and extended the life of locally slaughtered fresh meat, was, in Bong's words, a symbol of imperial taste. The establishment of cold storage was, however, prolonged by a litany of commercial failures. Even the cold storage company, now an iconic Singaporean success story, had a rocky beginning. After years of delays and much consumer anticipation, the meat that arrived in the first shipment was rumoured to have rotted on the long journey and have been further delayed by treatments to subdue the smell. Although there was no truth to that rumour, the meat still proved a bitter disappointment to customers. As one disgruntled purchaser noted in an irate letter to the editor, the quality of the meat is coarse. Reliable cold storage and reliable meat supply were slow to be established. Coloniality, modernisation, and industrialisation have had profound effects on food systems and taste. Through institutions like cold storage and abattoir, this trifecta has shaped ways food was assessed for health and safety, as well as how trust was established and gauged. In Singapore, discussions of pure food were influenced by international debates, with concerns about quality, economy, and animal welfare. The live trade export of cattle met some resistance in colonial Singapore. And it also failed to supply sufficient meat that met local tastes. That is, to borrow Harry Hirschfield's joke, the meat was terrible and in such small portions. British desire for meat had to be assuaged by other means, including canned meat, which involved different complex supply chains and the stories about them. Canned foods, but especially meat, were at the intersection of anxieties about industrial food production and tropical necessity. As an editorial in the Singapore Free Press and Mercantile Advertiser put it in January 1907, one of the most popular implements of domestic use in the Far East is the ordinary tin opener. In the imperial context, canned goods were also practical. They provided access to food not locally available and helped navigate tropical temperatures that made traditional British forms of food preservation, smoking, salting, drying, more challenging. 19th century newspaper readers in Singapore were, as I said, quite familiar with international discussions of food safety. The publication in 1856 of Arthur Hassell's report Food and Its Adulterations, for example, prompted many columns in local publications. Years later, decades later, in fact, Cross and Blackwell's, a well-known English brand of preserved goods, was still advertising their preserves and potted meat using extracts from the medical journal The Lancet, and Hansel was oft-quoted as a source of authority about quality internationally. Unsurprisingly, the publication of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in 1905 and the ensuing exposure of the American meatpacking industry generated voluminous newspaper columns in Singapore. These included reprints of articles, letters, and editorials from British newspapers, brief telegraph-based reports of American congressional responses, and much local commentary. The Jungle was originally published in serial form in the socialist magazine Appeal to Reason, ahead of mass publication by Doubleday in early 1906. It was not yet available in Singapore when a Straits Time editorial from mid-1906 bewailed that we have to rely on what our contemporaries at home have to say about it. Even in the absence of Sinclair's books, reports from newspapers around the globe furnished gruesome details for readers in Singapore. The Free Press and Mercantile Advertiser, for example, printed an illustrative account from London. It is stated that hogs dying of cholera were converted into lard and grease for sardine oil, that putrefied hams were chemically rendered odorless, that bad meat was dyed, that potted ham was made from mouldy beef, that cattle dying of disease were converted into tinned beef, that sausages were made from floor scrapings, and when operatives were mutilated, the machinery was not stopped, and human flesh was mixed with canned food and with sausage meat. A political novel, The Jungle is most keenly associated with food reform. But this was not what Sinclair intended. He aimed to shine a light on labour conditions, to reveal what industry was doing to their workers. Instead, he showed what the industry was doing to the meat supply of the civilised world. Sinclair, as he infamously put it, aimed at the public heart, and by accident he hit it in the stomach. The public was nauseated by what they read, but Sinclair wanted more. In fact, Sinclair explicitly set out to write a programmatic novel in the style of Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Commercial interests insisted upon the socialist nature of Sinclair's work, and it was. For commercial interests, this meant, and therefore it was not true. But this logic did not hold for Sinclair or for many of his readers. Described in the Straits Times in July 1906 as the novel that shocked the world, the international impact of The Jungle was frequently noted, even in the moment. Historian Aaron Hintler argues that the scramble for beef was very similar to the imperial moves to extract other resources, such as mineral and oil. For consumers of many classes and ethnicities in Singapore, imported meat was relied on, and the fear of contaminated supplies was simultaneously discursive and gustatory. Or, to put it another way, consumers in Singapore saw the jungle not simply as an American grotesquerie, but given their entanglement with complicated international supply chains, as a story that spoke directly to what was on their table. The Chicago packing scandals even prompted the lyrical responses, such as this one published in the Straits Times. Mary had a little lamb, and when she saw it stricken, she shipped it off to Packingtown, and now it is labeled chicken. That is, the scandal was a site of ghoulish speculation and humour, as well as being a cautionary tale, a spectacle that frightened. Commercial interests worried that the general anxiety about meat quality would have profound social and economic consequences. A rise in vegetarianism was predicted by some local commentators. Demand for meat fell first in the United States, then Britain, and then across the empire, and in Singapore itself. The drop in demand for New Zealand tinned meats, for example, was so significant that the New Zealand Postmaster General sought explanations in London to be assured that the reduction of sales of New Zealand tinned meat was not due to dissatisfaction with the New Zealand system of packing, but to the fact that the revelations regarding the industry in Chicago had checked all demand. Imports of Australian beef across the settlements fell almost by 30%. Imports of lambs, ham, and bacon fell too. Despite the fact that there were increases in costs of living, and these were quite frequently reported upon in the newspapers, there was actually no change in the cost of meat in Singapore between 1905 and 1906, which I think is quite interesting. Just as fear of food scandals was discursively globalized, so too was the desire for regulation. An editorial in the Eastern Daily Mail and Straits Advertiser, for example, called for a law to enable inspectors to supervise from hoof to can. I love that phrase, from hoof to can. The framing of hoof to can was not about nose to tail use of the whole animal, but of food safety as something that happened elsewhere, out of view. This discourse needed the slaughterhouse of the global pantry to be regulated, inspected, and supervised. The decision by Theodore Roosevelt, pictured here, to not require the date of production to be stamped on tinned meat produced in the United States was met with disappointment in Singapore. As one editorial put it, date stamps would comfort consumers that they had not purchased old goods, would reduce the perceived risk of poisoning, and that other diseases arising from bad tinned goods would be considerably minimized. An American decision to put meat packers and retailers ahead of the many, that is, consumers, deeply concerned the Straits Echo, in part because consumers in Singapore had no control over these distant processes. Singapore's journey to legislation began with the appointment of a municipal analyst, commissioned to establish if a food and drug ordinance was, quote, advisable. A.J. Harrington was appointed and played a critical role in convincing the municipal authorities of the need for legislation. Using public lectures to demonstrate the detection of adulteration, he also publicised the need for reform. Harrington tested a wide range of foods and drugs over a 2.5-year period. Of the 1,613 samples of food that he tested, he deemed that 1,184 of them were genuine. That is about a quarter, so 402 of his samples were clearly adulterated. 27 were of very poor quality, 56 were artificially coloured, but not necessarily in a harmful manner, and 114 contained additional preservatives than what they said was in the product. Harrington persuasively framed the desirability of an ordinance in multiple ways, including effects on the health of consumers, especially in relation to products such as milk for infants, but also on how far the public is defrauded by the adulteration. For the municipal authorities, the high level of adulteration of food was finally sufficient for action. Yet, as in other areas, Singapore's food legislation and regulation emphasised the municipal authority's role as an enforcer, whilst placing responsibility and cost for enactment on merchants and consumers. Upon presentation of the Singapore Legislative Council of what was to become the Sale of Food and Drug Act of 1914, the Governor General Arthur Young commented, "I do not suppose there are many spots in the British Empire today where there is not enforced some legislation containing the provisions in this bill. It is high time that we should have similar legislation." This desire to keep up may have been kindled by the American legislation, but it was fueled by the introduction of legislation across the British Empire. The Sale of Food and Drug Ordinance drew on British legislation and jurisprudence, including on the 1875 Sale of Food and Drug Act and the Amended Act of 1899. Reforms were happening around the empire, but interestingly, the Singapore law was most explicitly based on New Zealand's Sale of Food and Drug Act of 1908 to, quote, make better provision for the sale of food and drugs in a pure state. Accompanying the 1914 Act were complex regulations governing everything from food preparation venues, permissible additives, food colouring, vessels in which items could be sold, how much apple a mixed fruit jam could contain, no more than 20%, the font size and information to be supplied in labels, and so forth. Costs for compliance were imposed on producers and merchants, and consumers were expected to insist on these new standards. These regulations illustrate the specific context of Singapore, where, for example, foods for invalids were required to be labelled in English, Chinese, Tamil, and Malay. Everyday food objects, from condiment jars to the ceramic cups in kopitiams or coffee shops, show how localization intersects transnational culture. The colonial desire to regulate for safety and control, no containers with lead, arsenic, copper, or zinc to be used to store food, necessarily intersected with local commercial interpretations, reflecting and producing food cultures specific to Singapore. These regulations also show how meat remained a critical foodstuff, and one that required specific regulations and stipulations depending on its form. That is, fresh meat, chilled meat, frozen meat, pickled and salted meat, manufactured meat, dipping lard and gelatin were all subject to different regulations. Mostly, the meat regulations pertain to matters of definition, quality, and acceptable preservatives. Minced meats and sausages had to be made of at least 75% of the meat they claimed to be made from. Preserved meats could contain a maximum of 1 8/10 grains of the powder of sulfur dioxide. There was widespread support for both the ordinance and the regulations. The Attorney General noted in 1914 that in the 4 months following the publication of the regulations, no objections had been made by those most likely to be negatively affected by the high standards, that is, of vendors of food, drink, and drugs. However, I think we should be a little bit sceptical here. The place it was published was the Gazette, a colonial publication, and perhaps not many readers due to language literacy or interest in government publications. But in the cases that followed, it was largely non-white, especially Chinese residents, who were prosecuted under this legislation. In one example, a proprietor was prosecuted for exposure of sale of tinned meat unfit for human consumption, although that case was ultimately dismissed. Chua Sui was convicted of selling beef unfit for human consumption, unable to pay the $100 fine. He was imprisoned for 3 months. So let me pull some things together. The imperial desire to control spaces and processes imagines a disordered world and attempts to order it. But imperialism, with its capitalist imperatives, exploitative trade, and distanced supply chains, also produced the conditions in which food became unsafe. Food scandals, then, can be understood as simultaneously caused by imperialism and managed by imperialisms. In the wake of the jungle, sales of canned meat plummeted in America and Britain and in Singapore. But because there was insufficient supply of local fresh meat, when consumers in Singapore wanted meat, they often still relied on canned meat. Singapore, although quintessentially a cog in the British Empire, was also subject to other global and imperial forces, including notably those radiating from the United States. Fears about the safety of the food that ended up daily in the bowls and plates of Singapore reflected the complexity of global supply chains, real and discursive. Legislation to regulate food safety likewise existed at the intersection of pressing need and discursive desire. If food is never just food, as they say, this is especially true for meat.
Oh, that was fantastic. That was super interesting. Thank you so much, Nikki. Now we can open up the floor to questions. If there are any questions.
Please.
While everyone gathers their thoughts, I have a question. You had mentioned earlier that there was speculation that there would be a rise of vegetarianism, post. Did that actually happen?
No, but there was a lot of worry that it would. And there were a lot of newspaper columns speculating that if there was a rise in vegetarianism, it would kind of bring about with it a moral decay. So that kind of belief that there's a kind of moral superiority about meat consumption. That's what makes the British superior. And that an increase in vegetarianism would be a kind of reduction in the quality of people. But no more people became vegetarian, although there's this drop in canned meat consumption for a relatively short time.
Mm. Oh, thank you. That's really interesting. It kind of shows how resistant people are to changing habits. No, even though the source, may make them sick. And yeah, great. Any questions?
Don't bite. Promise.
Mhm.
Hi. I'm not sure if you covered this for your presentation, but is there any notes about how do you call it, like bush meat or hunted meat? I think wild boars, cows that were hunted.
Yes, so they are explicitly excluded from meats that are allowed to be taken to the abattoir. And that's in the legislation. So no wild meats to be processed, and that's anxiety about disease. People are engaging in hunting in Malaya, but they are not taking that meat to be processed in Singapore.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, Joseph. So we have a question from Kelsey.
Thank you. I found that was really neat how you added in about the context of America with the Upton, Sinclair, and the jungle. So then, so did it ever become available for Singaporeans to read, or did it just, it was mainly translated through the media, or
So there
or
was an
could you have,
enormous delay in its release, and so it was going to be coming, and it was going to be coming, and there's all this kind of speculation in newspapers. It does eventually come. I was not able to find information about the level of sales, but it appears in lots of library collections. So there's evidence that it was at the Raffles Library, for example. They've got records of that, but not of circulation. So I don't know how many people actually bought it or read it, but it was certainly available, but not until 1907.
thank you. And was meat being sent to Singapore from America?
Yes, it was, although often it was being sent indirectly. So it might be that meat was sent to Britain and then shipped from Britain. It could also be that American meat was being sent to the Philippines, but boats stopped in Singapore, and they would discharge some of their cargo. Manila got a cold storage facility much earlier than Singapore, and there's quite a lot of irritation that the Philippines have these facilities that Singapore doesn't, and there's jealousy that all these people in Manila are having access to Australian frozen meat when people in Singapore aren't. And there is also frozen American meat that is sent to the Philippines, some of which ends up being consumed in Singapore. And then just to kind of complicate that, there is Argentinian meat that is part of that whole cycle. So some of that was shipped both to Britain and to America, then processed and shipped. So you might, in the same can of meat, it was not necessarily the one animal from the one place, particularly in blended meat products.
That's great. Thank you. That's really interesting. And how currently Brazil is, a big importer for Singapore. Sina Pusat has a question in the chat. She says, I'm just wondering if you see any consequences or remnants of this in Singapore today. I realize this is not the main focus of the research, just interested. So I guess consequences, like, so do you see, impacts of the food regulation of the meat today?
So, I mean, one thing that I find really interesting amongst my Singaporean friends, who, if they are purchasing meat, will often go to quite considerable lengths to purchase what they consider to be safe meat. So they will go to specialist stores and say buy something organic or buy something that is imported from what they consider to be a desirable place, but never apply that logic at a hawker center, right? They are two really different kinds of meat consumption. So the things you buy to cook and the food you eat out, there's a separation. That said, the general quality and safety of meat available is incredibly high by international standards.
That's fascinating. That's a fascinating comparison. It's almost like two worlds and people just accept it. Thank you.
Yeah. Because it's hard. I mean, I think it is hard to have that conversation, and probably most people know, that chicken probably isn't organic and they want to eat it anyway because it's really delicious. And if you don't ask the question, then you don't have the answer you don't want.
Excellent point. So Jackie Kong asked a question for you. Thank you, Dr. Nikki, for extremely detailed analysis of meat and the anxiety surrounding it in colonial times. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the current discourse on alternative proteins, especially cultured meat, either in Singapore or in Australia, where you are currently?
Mm. There are people sitting in this Zoom who know a lot more about this than me, and Amy might want to jump in the chat and say something. Look, I mean, Singapore is really leading in this space. The the cultivated meats that are now available in Singapore are not available in Australia yet. There are lots of meat alternatives. So there's been a huge expansion in plant-based proteins in Australia in the last decade. And my observation, and I say this as a consumer rather than as a historian, one of the things that transition has done is a group of people are now purchasing an enormously more processed and more packaged set of foods. So a lot of the plant-based foods are highly processed and highly packaged. So instead of, buying something wrapped in a piece of paper from the butcher, it comes in layers of packaging. I think in terms of what will happen going forward, there's a lot in that space.
That's a great comment about all the packaging, because there are all more moments for discursive analysis too. All the text has been written on it as well. Yeah, that's really, thank you. Kuzuhiko has a question for you. Thank you, Nikki, for your thought-provoking question. This could be out of context, but I wonder if the consumption of fish, seafood, or processing of it had a similar historical relationship to the British imperialism of Singapore as you presented the case of meat today.
That is a great question. So, I mean, I think it is really fascinating how the British kind of ate fish, but in very classed ways, and often really ignored the bounty. So in Australia, for example, in the early colonial period, Australians' waters are filled with luscious seafood, and yet there's still quite a desire for canned meat, so for canned fish, so tinned sardines and the like. There is a great article which looks at the introduction of some specific fish in British Malaya, so like trout and carp in, carp and rice paddies and so forth, and trout in the Highlands, introduced for sport. And we can definitely see the introduction of specific fish species as a kind of bioimperialism. So I think there's no difference between, importing sheep or cows and changing the physical environment than there is importing, trout and changing the waterways. So I think that's really similar. And I think I was talking specifically about meat, but there is also a lot of anxiety about canned fish as well. And there are a couple of really sensational food poisoning cases around seafood. And canned seafood, it's one of the early products to be canned. So, out of Baltimore, you have canned oysters quite early, for example. So again, British, but also global.
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't realize that the fish would also be part of the British imperialism as well. Amy Pink wants to add on. She says, just to add on what Nikki said, from a safety issue, research I've conducted in Singapore suggests people are very wary of the safety of cultivated meat. They're less concerned about plant-based, but don't deem it fresh as it is frozen. That's,
Yeah.
Interesting. People think insects are safer due to long-term consumption elsewhere, but still will not eat them due to disgust and fear. Yes, I have found that too in my research on insects as being, a source of disgust and fear people don't want to eat, but they usually swat away. So
Yeah.
thinking,
I mean, Amy's point about frozen is really interesting because, actually frozen was equated with safer, right? Because of where it came from. So frozen meat coming from Australia and New Zealand, really desirable. But then by later in the 20th century, frozen means not fresh. So the very meaning of what freshness is contingent. And Susan Freiberg's written a great book about freshness where she talks about how the qualities that we find desirable in particular foods are constructed by food technology. So, we think that a fresh lettuce is one that is cold straight out of the fridge and crisp, not one that we pick out of the ground, but quite objectively, the one we pick out of the ground is, that has just stopped being in the ground is fresher, but our ideas of freshness have changed. So I'm really interested in Amy's comment that the plant-based is seen as less fresh. And I guess it's also worth kind of teasing out that safety can mean different things for different people as well. So there's something that can be culturally safe versus something that, it just won't make you sick. So the absence of something versus the presence of something.
that's a great point. And the term fresh as well can be teased out further because how a lot of cow's milk is labeled as fresh milk. So it kind of implies that non-cow's milk maybe aren't as fresh. So I've seen that terminology used here in particular in Singapore with Australian products versus in the US, you don't see dairy, cow's milk labeled as fresh. So
that distinction is about UHT, right? Is it heat treated and shelf stable versus is it perishable? But I think that, can your almond or your oat be fresh? Is a fun thing to think about too.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Amy asked, what was the book title about the fresh frozen debate?
The book is called Fresh, A Perishable History.
Oh, that's clever.
Susan Freiberg.
Fresh.
She also wrote a really fun piece about green beans.
That's great. All right, well, thank you. Any other last questions or comments? All right, well, thank you so much. This was a fascinating talk this afternoon. Thank you, Professor Tarulevicz, and we look forward to reading more of your work and having you here again.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Kerry.
All right, thank you.